There's a quiet power in those who know who they are. They don't speak to prove, they speak to move. They don't enter rooms to be seen. They enter with a presence that shifts the atmosphere. They don't chase validation because their direction is already clear. And when the world tries to define them, reduce them, question them, they don't flinch. They don't defend. They simply continue. Because when you have conviction, you don't argue your identity. You live it. You don't look in the mirror wondering who you are. You look in the mirror asking yourself, am I still aligned with the truth I said I'd live by? That's the difference. The world is full of people who are loud but hollow. Loud because they need to convince others. Hollow because they haven't convinced themselves. And so they need applause to feel real. They need constant feedback to feel enough. They need someone else to name them because they haven't done the hard work of naming themselves. But you are not that. You're not here to impress. You're here to express. You're not here to collect identities handed to you. You're here to forge one that can't be taken. One that is not a costume, but a conviction. One that doesn't change when people stop clapping. One that doesn't collapse when life stops being easy. Because the truth is, identity without clarity is a prison. You become a reflection of every room you walk into. You become whoever they need you to be. You lose yourself in the image you think they'll love. And then one day you wake up and realize you've become everyone except you. But those with conviction, they don't drift like that. They don't ask, what do they want from me? They ask, what did I come here to bring? That shift, that one question, changes everything. It puts you back in the driver's seat. It reminds you, you are not a reaction. You are a response, a conscious, chosen, rooted response to life. And yes, that kind of life isn't always applauded. Conviction makes people uncomfortable. It confronts the part of them still pretending, still shape-shifting, still chasing applause they don't need. Because when you live with clarity, you reflect back what they haven't owned in themselves. And not everyone can handle that. But that's not your concern. You weren't born to be understood. You were born to be true. You were born to be whole. And wholeness means living with alignment, even when it costs you popularity, even when it gets lonely, even when it doesn't make sense to the world. Because peace is never found in pretending. It's found in presence. Presence that comes from standing in your yes and your no. Without guilt, without needing permission, without seeking a round of applause. This is what real identity feels like. It's not performance. It's not perfection. It's principle. And principle doesn't waver every time the wind blows. Principle doesn't collapse every time someone disagrees. It holds. It grounds. It centers you when everything else is chaos. And no, that doesn't mean you never evolve. You will grow. You will shift. But growth isn't the same as confusion. Evolving isn't the same as being lost. Growth means you deepen your roots. You don't throw away your core. You refine it. You test it. You prove it. And every time life tries to shake you, you stand. Not because you're stubborn, but because you're anchored. You know where you stand, and you know why. That's what makes you untouchable. That's what gives your life weight. Not the number of people who agree with you, but the depth of your alignment with yourself. So if the world doesn't get it, that's fine. If the world laughs, that's fine. If the world ignores, questions, or misunderstands, that's fine. Because when you live with conviction, you are no longer moved by noise. You are moved by truth. And truth has never needed a crowd to be real. It just needs a vessel, someone willing to carry it even when it costs, especially when it costs. And maybe that's why you've felt so heavy lately, because the truth inside you is growing too big for the mask you've been wearing. Maybe that ache in your chest isn't confusion. It's clarity knocking. It's truth rising. It's conviction returning. The question is, will you let it in? Will you stop asking who you are and start being who you already know yourself to be? Conviction doesn't live in your thoughts. It lives in your choices. It's not just a philosophy, it's a pattern. It shows up when you walk away from what's easy, for what's true, when you stop explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand you, when you set boundaries not to punish others but to protect your peace, because conviction isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It whispers in the moment you say no when your whole body used to say yes just to be liked. It breathes in the silence after you walk away from things that once defined your worth. It lives in the discipline of doing what aligns, even when no one sees it, even when no one claps. Because this is the price of being real. You won't always be understood. You won't always be liked. But you'll sleep deeper, walk steadier, and feel alive again, because nothing is more exhausting than betraying yourself for the sake of approval, and nothing is more energizing than living a life that's yours, not borrowed, not rehearsed, not filtered through other people's expectations. Just you, raw, clear, and rooted. And the more you live that way, the more you'll notice something strange. People start reacting differently. Some will pull away, not because you've changed, but because you've become unchangeable, because you no longer mold yourself to fit their comfort, because your clarity exposes their confusion. And some people can't handle that, but others, they'll be drawn to you, not because you're charming, but because you're solid, because in a world full of noise, you sound like truth. In a world full of doubt, you feel like certainty. And not because you have all the answers, but because you finally stopped betraying your own. You speak from a place of lived truth, not borrowed belief. You lead your own energy. You carry a presence that doesn't beg to be noticed, but refuses to be ignored. And that's what real impact is. Not controlling people, but inspiring them to come back home to themselves. Not impressing them, but giving them permission to stop pretending. But none of that starts until you stop pretending, until you stop shrinking, until you stop asking questions you already know the answers to, just because you're afraid of what following those answers might cost. Yes, it's going to cost you. That's the truth nobody wants to say. Conviction will cost you comfort. It will cost you fake peace. It will cost you shallow relationships and surface-level success. But what it gives back, it gives you weight. You're no longer tossed by every opinion, every trend, every shift in the wind. You stand. And in a world where everyone's floating, standing is revolutionary. It's not stubbornness, it's presence. It's the art of not moving just because they don't like where you stand. It's the strength to hold the line, not to be right, but to be aligned. Because conviction isn't about being better than anyone. It's about being fully you, without apology, without disguise. And the more you live that way, the less you feel the need to argue. You don't need to convince anyone anymore. You're not here to win debates. You're here to embody truth. That's what makes you dangerous. That's what makes you real. You are no longer performing. You are living. You are no longer searching. You are showing. And that kind of clarity, that kind of congruence, it's rare, it's magnetic, it's disruptive. Because people don't fear someone who's smart. They fear someone who knows exactly who they are and refuses to forget it for anyone. They fear someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to lose, because that person is finally free. When you stop questioning who you are, the world starts to question how they ever thought they could shape you, because nothing is more threatening to control than someone who is no longer looking outside for who they are. They can't shame you into silence. They can't guilt you into compliance. They can't flatter you into abandoning yourself. Why? Because you've made the decision that most people never make. The decision to belong to yourself. And when you belong to yourself, you no longer chase people who make you feel like too much. You no longer play small to be accepted. You no longer smile to survive. You walk into rooms and you don't perform. You exist, fully, freely, without trying to fit into their version of who you should be. And yes, it's uncomfortable at first, because they won't know where to place you. They'll project, they'll test, they'll withdraw. But that's not rejection, that's revelation. It's revealing who was only with you when you were smaller. It's revealing who only clapped when you were digestible. And you're no longer here to be digestible. You're here to be whole. That kind of energy, calm, rooted, unapologetically sovereign. It intimidates people who live by external cues. It confronts people who haven't done the work. It makes them uneasy because you're not looking to be led. And you're not trying to lead either. You're just aligned. And that's enough to shift every room you enter. You become the mirror they didn't ask for. The mirror that shows them everything they're not owning in themselves. That's why your silence speaks louder now. That's why your stillness feels like strength. Because it's not passive, it's chosen. You don't react because you no longer need to. You don't explain because your life already does. You don't compete because you're not in their race. You've stepped out of the comparison game completely. Because when you know who you are, you don't need to prove it. You just live it. And the more you live from that space, the less people know how to manipulate you. They can't press your buttons because you've disconnected the panel. They can't trigger you because you've already healed what used to hurt. They can't distract you because your focus is not for sale. And suddenly people stop knowing how to control you because the only thing that ever gave them power was your own self-doubt. The moment you stopped asking for approval, they lost control. The moment you started trusting your intuition over their opinions, the dynamic shifted. You became untouchable, not because you built walls, but because you built clarity. And clarity, that's the most powerful boundary of all. It's not aggressive. It doesn't need to fight. It just knows. It walks into a situation and it doesn't ask, will they like me? It asks, is this aligned with who I am and where I'm going? And if the answer is no, you leave. Not with drama, not with revenge, just with peace. Because the people who are truly powerful don't destroy things. They release them. And they do it without guilt, without second guessing, without begging someone to understand. Because their peace is no longer negotiable, and neither is their identity. You've done the work. You've faced the discomfort. You've owned the truth. And now you walk differently, talk differently, choose differently, not because you're trying to be someone, but because you've finally remembered you don't need to try at all. You just need to be. And when you live like that, your presence becomes louder than your words. Your consistency becomes your statement. Your alignment becomes your influence. You don't need followers. You need truth. You don't need permission. You need presence. And that's what makes you different now. You're not here to be everything for everyone. You're here to be one thing, fully yourself. You don't have to shout when your life is speaking for you. You don't need to explain when your energy says it all. When you live with conviction, your presence does what your words never could. You start teaching without preaching, leading without chasing, changing people, not through pressure, but through presence. Because conviction isn't just about knowing who you are. It's about living who you are so fully, so consistently, that you give others permission to do the same. Not by telling them what to do, but by being someone who no longer apologizes for existing fully. When people meet that kind of clarity, something shifts. They pause, they reflect. Some feel drawn, some feel exposed, but none walk away untouched. Because real alignment is contagious, it awakens people. Not in one moment, but slowly, like a mirror that doesn't force you to look but quietly stands, showing you what you could be if you finally stopped pretending. That's what you become. Not a spotlight, a mirror. Not loud, but undeniable. Not flashy, but unforgettable. And that mirror will disrupt. It will challenge. It will shake things up. Because when you embody your truth, you no longer fit inside the frameworks that made others comfortable. You break the mold, not to be different, but to be real. You start making decisions based on your own values, not trends. You say yes because it's aligned, not because it's expected. You say no without guilt, because every no to them is a yes to yourself. And over time, people start noticing. You become the one they go to, not because you have the most answers, but because you have the most peace. Not because your life is loud, but because your life is centered. You become a reference point, not perfect, not finished, but anchored. And in a world that constantly shifts with the latest fear, trend, or opinion, people are starved for anchors, for someone who isn't swayed by every gust of wind, for someone who chooses principle over popularity, depth over noise, integrity over image. That's who you're becoming, not an echo, a voice, not a reaction, a response. And not because you're trying to impress, because you're no longer trying at all. You're just being, and being is magnetic when it's real. It's disruptive when it's true. People may resist it at first. They may distance themselves, label you, question your change, but eventually they return. Not always with applause, sometimes with silence, sometimes with reflection, because your growth stirred something in them. Your boundaries made them face their own. Your stillness made them see their chaos. Your decision to stop explaining yourself made them realize how much they still over-explain. And that's how the world changes, one person at a time, choosing to live with clarity, no matter the cost. One person deciding that peace is more important than praise, that authenticity is more valuable than agreement, that alignment is stronger than applause. And you're not here to be everyone's favorite. You're here to be true, to wake up day after day and ask one question: am I living in a way that's true to who I've claimed to be? If the answer is yes, keep going. If the answer is no, adjust. Not to impress anyone, not to fix your image, but because you care too much about your own peace to keep betraying it. You've seen what happens when you silence your truth. You've felt the emptiness of performing. You've tasted the regret of not standing when your soul begged you to. So now you walk differently. Now you speak from a place of knowing. Now you live not to be accepted, but to be aligned. And every step you take, others watch, not always consciously, but they feel it. They feel the clarity in your tone, the groundedness in your eyes, the peace in your silence. And slowly, without even trying, you become a reminder to them of what's possible. That's influence, that's impact, not volume, but vibration, not position, but presence, not fame, but frequency. And the more you live this way, the more unshakable you become. You don't just walk in conviction, you radiate it. And when that happens, your life becomes your loudest message. Conviction is not something you carry to show the world. It's something that carries you when the world no longer makes sense. It's what steadies your breath when chaos rises. It's what pulls you back into yourself when everything outside wants to shake you. And the longer you live in it, the more you realize this isn't about having all the answers. It's about standing in the ones you already know. It's about living a life that's congruent. So when people ask who you are, you don't say it, you show it. Not through your resume or your reputation or your role, but through the way you show up, the way you listen, the way you love without losing yourself, the way you say no when your peace is at stake, the way you hold the line, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. And in the end, that's what legacy is. It's not how many people remember your name. It's how many people remember the feeling of being around you, the way your presence made them feel safe to be themselves. Because when you live with conviction, you give others the courage to stop pretending. You give others the proof that it's possible to live without performing, to choose peace over people-pleasing, to choose principle over pressure, to choose depth over distraction. And maybe that's your real purpose, not to be everything, but to be exactly what you are, unapologetically. Because in a world that's constantly pushing you to be more, do more, have more, Maybe what we really need is someone who reminds us how powerful it is to just be real. Not perfect, not polished, not packaged, just real, aligned, anchored, awake. That's the kind of life that leaves a mark, not because you forced it, but because you lived it. Fully, presently, quietly, but unmistakably. That's the irony. The most powerful people are rarely the loudest. They don't chase impact, they embody it. They don't sell themselves, they serve through self-respect. They don't need to dominate the room. They own their space. And that's enough. Because when you're grounded, you don't need attention. When you're clear, you don't need permission. And when you're true, you don't need to be understood. You just need to stay steady, not in your ego, but in your essence. That's what people remember, not what you said, but how you stood, not what you proved, but what you chose when it would have been easier to fold. And most of all, how you kept showing up when no one was watching. That's what conviction looks like. That's what wholeness feels like. You are no longer waiting to become someone. You are someone. And the journey now is to keep being that, even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, even when no one claps, even when you're misunderstood, because you know something they don't. Clarity is a compass, and once you have it, even when the road is unclear, you're not. You walk with direction. You love with boundaries. You give without losing. You live without explaining. And when you die one day, and you will, may it be said of you that you never tried to be everything. You just had the courage to be yourself, fully, fiercely, faithfully, and that was more than enough.